to address. And so, as we consider the book of Daniel, and we looked at this a little bit last week, if you remember in the second half, beginning in chapter 7, after Daniel was in the lion's den, in the second half of Daniel, Daniel now is the one having the visions and the dreams. He has interpreted in times past for Nebuchadnezzar and also for Belshazzar. Now Daniel is the one that's having dreams and visions. And if you recall back in Daniel chapter 7, and really this continues on throughout the book, where we have these time references of the kings that were ruling at that time. And those become important because they help us to see when these events are taking place. So like in Daniel chapter 7, you have Belshazzar, king of Babylon, who we read earlier in chapter 5. And then in chapter 8, you have Belshazzar again, but it changes from the first year to the third year. So we know that Belshazzar was defeated in Daniel chapter 5 by the Persians. And so that helps us to understand how these things are really woven together and these events that are taking place. That's important as well because in Daniel chapter 2, we read about those kingdoms. In Daniel chapter 7, we read about these great beasts that Daniel sees in his vision, right? And we talked about the lion and the bear and the leopard and the fourth beast, this ferocious beast. And these beasts represent kings and kingdoms, very much like Daniel chapter 2. So now in Daniel chapter 3, as we just mentioned here, we have time references. We have another vision subsequent to the one which appeared previously. Daniel's vision, very much similar in the remaining parts of these chapters, at least 7, 8, and 9. 10, 11, and 12 are really a unit. The first half really is the vision or the dream. The second half is the interpretation. And who is helping Daniel with understanding these dreams and visions? Who helps him? I heard murmuring. Who? Angels. Yes, angels. So Daniel has been the one that has helped others. Now angels are helping him. And so these visions and dreams that Daniel often has or now is having, how does he typically respond, or what are some of the responses after he experiences some of these dreams and visions? He is typically what? Yeah, exhausted, pale. He's fasting in Daniel chapter 10. He's maybe even a little bit confused, trying to figure out, how is all this working? So why is this important? Well, because Daniel is being seen or shown things that are going to take place in future times. Some of those things are not necessarily good for the people of God, particularly the Israelites that are going to come after him. So in Daniel chapter 8, you have this vision, and you have the vision in Daniel chapter 8 of a ram and of a goat, a male goat. And we see later on in the chapter the interpretation. I believe it was Gabriel in Daniel chapter 8 in verse 16 that would help explain this vision to Daniel. Now in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20 and 21, we get the interpretation. The ram is representing, which you saw, the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Verse 21, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, and that would be King or Alexander the Great. So these visions are being interpreted. The angels are helping Daniel with respect to understanding these visions. And something else that's very interesting here in verse 22 of Daniel chapter 8, it says, the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which will arise from his nation. So he's talking about Alexander the Great, who was king or ruler over Greece. He dies at a very young age. He reigns from 331 to 323, I believe. And about 20 years or so after his death, four rulers are going to rise after him. And his empire is going to be divided. And so you have Ptolemy and Seleucus here. Ptolemy is going to rule the south, or Egypt. Seleucus is going to rule the north, or Syria. Now, why is all this important? Well, it's important because we really get a breakdown of all of these events with Ptolemy and Seleucus and the kings or rulers that would come after them in the north and the south in Daniel chapter 11. So if you read Daniel chapter 11, there's a lot of information there about Persia, Greece, Alexander the Great, Ptolemy and Seleucus, and then rulers that would come after them. So Daniel chapter 11 is a pretty big chapter, but I'm mentioning this to you here because what we're going to see in Daniel chapter 11 actually points back to some of the things or events that we've already seen, like here in Daniel chapter 8. And we did also mention in Daniel chapter 8, in verse 17, how this vision pertains to the time of the end. And so with this context, the time of the end is pertaining to Persia and Greece. So understanding this time of the end or this time marker is not necessarily talking about the second coming of Christ, but it has to be couched within this context. And then at the end of Daniel chapter 8, it says, in the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. You see that language almost verbatim in Daniel chapter 11. And that's talking about a ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. So what we have here in Daniel chapter 8 is what we're going to see again in Daniel chapter 11, at least in some of it. Daniel chapter 11 is really exciting because we get even additional detail about additional rulers that came after these two men who initially ruled the south and the north. So the south and the north, all of this information, why do we need to know it? Well, because they're referenced this way in Daniel chapter 11 when we get there. So we'll get there in just a moment. So I just wanted to remind you of that and why or how does Israel fall into this? Well, the north and the south are going to war against each other for an extended period of time, and some have called Jerusalem or the people of God, like a soccer ball or some other description of how they bounce back and forth under rule under these different empires. And so unfortunately, they're going to be caught in the middle. And so what Daniel is witnessing, particularly like in Daniel chapter 8, and as we'll see in Daniel chapter 11, he is seeing persecution that his people, the Israelites, are going to experience. And that's where we get time references like in Daniel 8 and verse 14, these 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. Because in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, there is going to be just horrendous events that are going to be done in the temple of God by him. And so what we're seeing here is persecution that God's people are going to experience. So understanding that becomes really important. And there's so many different, in the workbook, there was a lot of information given about different rulers and who ruled at particular times. And understanding this, where the north would control Jerusalem beginning in 198 until about 165, well, that would be towards the end or at the end of the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. So understanding that becomes important as we think about these big events that we're going to see in just a moment here. So we got to chapter 10. In Daniel chapter 10, we see here, this is a reference that goes back to verse number 1. Chapter 1. If you remember back in Daniel chapter 1, let's see if my memory is correct here. At the end of Daniel chapter 1, we see Daniel and King Cyrus mentioned here. And we see here this last vision that's going to take place in the days of King Cyrus here in chapter 10. And so in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. And the message was true and one of great conflict. But he understood the message and had an understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed. And that seems to be the case as a result of this vision that he had, that he is fasting and mourning. He's not really doing anything with respect to hygiene for these entire 3 weeks. Verse number 4, it was the 24th day of the first month while I was by the bank of the great river that is the Tigris. And so this normally would have been a period of celebration for the Israelites at this time, as they would have celebrated the deliverance that God provided for them in the days of Egypt. And this would have been about 10 days after the Passover. Now, if you jump over to Daniel chapter 12 here, please. In Daniel chapter 12, we're going to see really the conclusion of what begins in chapter 10, what continues in chapter 11, and then as we wrap it up in chapter 12. And when you look at verse number 5, it says, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, How long will it be until the end of these wonders? I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river." So this information here fits perfectly with what we're reading here, back here in chapter 10. In verse number 5 of Daniel chapter 10, he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen. So that helps us to see that this is one unit or a block that is beginning in chapter 10 and continues in chapter 11 and then wraps up in chapter 12. So that's important. When this was written, there were no chapter divisions at this time. And so understanding that this is one big reveal, or this introduction to the vision, the aspects of this vision or revelation, and then this conclusion, I think that will help us as well as we consider the context, particularly who's being mentioned at the end of Daniel chapter 11 and the events that are taking place in Daniel chapter 12. So we looked at last week in Daniel chapter 10, verses 6 and 7, how Daniel saw this man dressed in linen. And I believe this is referring to another angel or angelic being here. And when Daniel, he sees this vision in verse number 7, it says, "While the men who were with me did not see the vision, nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. So I was left alone and saw this great vision. Yet no strength was left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. Then behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. He said to me, O Daniel," verse 11, "man of high esteem, understand the words that I'm about to tell you, and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you." And when he had spoken this word, I stood up trembling. Typical response when you're in front of someone like this, right? He is standing up trembling. He says to him in verse 12, "Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God," and we know that that was the disposition or attitude Daniel had, going back to Daniel chapter 9, with his prayer that he had for the nation and also for himself. He said that you have set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard. Great book when it comes to prayer, right? God hears the prayers of the righteous. And that's the confidence that we need to have. Remember what James says in James chapter 1. The way that we ask, let us not be double-minded. Let us not be like an unstable person who is double-minded. We should have this great confidence when it comes to our prayers. Daniel prayed consistently. Why would he do that in the face of persecution back in Daniel chapter 6? Well, because he knew that the God of heaven hears. Why would Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego pray to God, all night in Daniel chapter 2, when they got news that Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill all of the wise men? Because they believed in the power of prayer. So that needs to be our mindset as well. So, but the prince, verse 13, verse 12, "From the first day that you prayed, that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Who's the kingdom of Persia? The prince of the kingdom of Persia. Real quickly here, it's the last class. We've got to get through the end of the book. Any thoughts? The prince of the kingdom of Persia. All right, I'm rolling with it's some kind of angel, some kind of spirit being. That's my understanding. All right? Who's talking to him? If this is an angel that's talking to him, then the angel is saying, listen, God heard your prayers from the very first day that you prayed, and I have come in response to your words. So he's having this vision. This angelic being, this spiritual being is speaking to him, and now he speaks about this prince of the kingdom of Persia withstanding him for 21 days. Furthermore, I think we can be sure that it is some kind of angel, because you have Gabriel mentioned in Daniel chapter 9, you have Gabriel mentioned in Daniel chapter 8, and then you have Michael, who's mentioned here in Daniel chapter 13. We know that Michael was an angel according to Jude, verse number 9. We know that Micah was an angel according to Revelation chapter 12 and verse number 7. I love this because it shows us that there are things taking place behind the scenes. And you have these angels responding to Daniel, assisting Daniel, and you're actually going to see angels assisting one another, where it says, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. So it appears to be these angelic beings that have some role or are doing something in the affairs of men and these governments. And I think that's what we're going to see as we continue on in chapter 11. Now, I've come to give you an understanding of what will happen to, listen to this, in verse 14, your people in the latter days, for the vision pertains to the days yet future. So he's talking about his people in the latter days. When he had spoken to the according of these words, I turned my face to the ground, and I became speechless. So Daniel, this is a lot for Daniel to take in. And this man here is going to assist him again. Look at verse 19. O man of high esteem, do not be afraid. Peace be with you. Take courage. Be courageous. Now as soon as he spoke to me, I received strength, and said, May my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. So watch what he says next here. And I think this helps us as we continue on in chapter 11. Do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. So it appears again here we have this spiritual battle that has taken place here. Could it be referring to a physical king or prince? Well, I don't know how a physical man could delay this angel 21 days. And so that's my understanding of that. And it's interesting at the end of verse 21 that he says, yet there's no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. And that sounds like maybe the prince for Israel or Judah. Comments or questions about that? There's a lot in there. It's a very fascinating text. I think the New Testament also helps us with this idea of these angels. We know that angels are real. We're going to be talking about spiritual warfare in the fourth quarter. I'm going to be doing a class on that. And so we get a glimpse of this. Now, we don't have all the details, but we do have enough details where this explanation and information is given to Daniel here. So on page 84, I've already answered this with how Daniel often responded. And I think there's a lot that we can learn about angels and spiritual warfare here, where we have this pulling back of the curtain. And we know that I think Jude is a great example of this. While we don't have additional details of this, in Jude, in verse number 9, it says, But Michael the archangel, same Michael here, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, The Lord rebuke you. So we know that Michael was an archangel. We know that there's this interaction between him and the devil. We don't have additional details about that. But we read about Michael in a number of places here in the scriptures. So excellent study. There may be more questions with that as a result or later on. And if you have more questions, let me know. So let's look at chapter 11. So how do I want to do this? We got 45 verses. We don't have time to look at every single verse. So let me give you a lay of the land here. Yeah. So chapter 11, if you remember, chapter 10 and 11 and 12, they are a unit. So in verse 21 of chapter 10, he says, However, this angel, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. That sounds like that's the angel still speaking here. And we have another time reference here in the first year of Darius. And so this goes back to some of the events or some of the times that we've already seen in the second half of this book, like Daniel chapter 9 in the first year of Darius. And so what we're going to see here is actually looping back to some of these events that we had already seen. And so that's why those time references become important, making sure we understand when these things are taking place and helping us just to keep everything within context. So he says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. So that's the angel speaking to Daniel. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. So we've talked about Babylon, we've talked about Persia, we've talked about Greece, and we've talked about Rome. Here on the slide here, after Cyrus, we know that these other kings are going to arise after him. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Well, we know who was the big guy in Greece, right? We've already talked about him numerous times, according to Daniel chapter 8, Alexander the Great. So you see how he's going back to the days of Persia. At the end of verse 2, he says, okay, in the days of this last king, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece, and a mighty king will arise. And he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Well, that's Alexander the Great. And so we've already looked at this, and that's why Daniel chapter 8 is a good chapter to go back to as you consider Daniel chapter 11. Because we're talking about Persia, and we get some additional details here about Persia with some additional kings, and then Greece, once again, with Alexander the Great. So we already know, we're not going to go through all that again, that Alexander the Great was a mighty king, and he will rule with great authority. He is that goat in Daniel chapter 8, and do as he pleases. Look at verse 4. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up. Well, he only ruled for a short amount of time after he conquered the world, about 8 years. And history helps us to see that I believe he had 2 children, but they would be killed off. And it says, but as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants. So remember back in Daniel chapter 8, we read about that, right? The horn is going to be broken. 4 horns are going to arise in his place, representing 4 kingdoms. Well, that's what this is saying right here. His kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others beside them. So you have these rulers that are going to come up after him, but they're not going to be as powerful as him. And history helps us to see who these individuals were. And we've already talked about Ptolemy, who ruled the south, and Seleucus, who ruled the north. And these really are going to be the big emphasis here in chapter 11 when you look at the rest of this chapter here. So look at verse number 5. Then the king of the south. So when he begins to speak about the king of the south, well, now this gives us this indication of who he is talking about. He's talking about Ptolemy here, Ptolemy the first. And so what we're going to see here, beginning in verses 5 through 20, and really even further, but we'll stop there, is really this amazing recount, this awesome account, this predictive prophecy of future events that are going to take place after the death of Alexander the Great and by these rulers who came after him. Now, as you read Daniel chapter 11, it is important to remember that God's people and the promised land, the Holy Land, the beautiful land, was a constant point of contention between these Greek forces in Egypt and Syria. And that's what we're going to see as well. The beautiful land that's mentioned in verse 16 is talking about this land. And God's people are often going to be caught in the middle of this. And we talked about that earlier as well. And so something else that's important is that this chapter here is more than just talking about one particular king. You have Ptolemy who begins, but then the rulers who come after him, along with Seleucus, if I'm pronouncing their names correctly. So what I did here, I put together this little chart. I borrowed it, looked at it, took it, saw it from somewhere else. It helped me to understand some things. What I have here are a list of some of the rulers that we read about in Daniel chapter 11. And it can get kind of confusing when you're just reading, going through the text. Anybody get confused reading Daniel chapter 11? I mean, it's like bouncing all over the place. But if we try to make this simple for the sake of understanding, when you go back and look at history, and that's one of the great blessings or great things that we have in this book, where we have such detail about the kings after the first king, and the king that's going to rule Greece, and who's going to come after him. Well, we can look back in history to get a glimpse of who these individuals were. And the stories that we find here are so fascinating, where we read about, like in verse 5, then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. After some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. And we can go back and look at history to see who these individuals were. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is to really take some time to look in the workbook. There's a lot of great information in the workbook with respect to many of these historical events. And again, the workbook at times can be a little bit challenging, I think, to read. I think if it was laid out a little bit different. But he does have good divisions in here where you can look at, like on page 77, for example, he talks about the rise and fall of the Grecian Empire. And so what he does here, he lays out some of these rulers here. He talks about Alexander the Great on page number 78. He talks about a series of wars that took place. And that's what you see on this slide. And so I put the verses where these individuals, who these individuals are according to these verses. And so understanding this will help you as you navigate your way along through Daniel chapter 11. So as you're reading Daniel chapter 11, keep a couple of things in mind. Number one, these are events taking place after the death of Alexander the Great, these rulers in the days of Greece, right? And there are a variety of wars that are taking place between the north and between the south. The north and the south are representing different rulers at that time. And who's in the middle of these battles? Who's caught in the middle of all these battles? The Israelites, the people of God. They're caught in the middle of these battles. And sometimes they're going to rise up as well, and sometimes they're going to fight as well. And a lot of bad things are going to happen. And so this is what we see here in Daniel chapter 11, verses 5 through 20. So we see the people of God, unfortunately, in the middle. If you look at verse number 14 of Daniel chapter 11, it says, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. And you get a glimpse there here of who that was referring to if you look on the slide in verse number 11, or verse number 14. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. So some of the Israelites are going to be fighting as well, but they will not be successful, at least there. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and then capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. And that seems to be talking about Antiochus the Great, all the way down to verse number 19. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. And he will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, with destruction in his hand. He'll set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. And history says that he gave his daughter Cleopatra I in marriage to Ptolemy V. But things aren't going to work out, and his plan of what he was trying to accomplish is not going to work out, as we see here. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. And so this is talking about Antiochus the Great, and he was ruling from 223 to 187 BC. And so we can get a glimpse with looking at some of these verses of who is ruling at what particular time. Verse number 20, we find another individual who would rule in the north, and his rule would be somewhat short. There's only one verse mentioned about him, where it says, "Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. In his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in at a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue." Well, that points us right back to Daniel chapter 8. And Antiochus Epiphanes is now who's being discussed here, beginning in verses 21 through 35. So he is this one that is going to persecute God's people during this time that we read about at the end of Daniel chapter 8. He would rule from 175 to 163 BC. And what we see here in these latter verses are different events that would take place. Murder, so that he would eventually get to this position of rule. Deception, like in verse number 23, where he would pronounce peace in verse 23 and 24, but then would devise schemes for a time. Verse number 25, he's going to go against Ptolemy the sixth there, as you see on the slide in the north or in the south. That's what's taking place in verses 25 through 27. So we have all of this detail, and this is important because so much has already been emphasized by Daniel in Daniel chapter 8. Now, the significance of this for the people of God in Daniel chapter 8 and now here in Daniel chapter 11, that the people of God are going to suffer persecution. He's going to do a tremendous amount of wicked deeds. In verse number 28, he's going to come against the Holy Covenant. He's going to come against the people of God. Later on, after he is beaten by Rome, like in verse 29 and verse number 30, it says in verse 31, "Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation." And history says that he hung an image of Jupiter in the temple. And so all of these horrific events are taking place here. One point that's very important to keep in mind, this abomination of desolation here in verse 31 does not seem to be the same one that is mentioned at the end of Daniel chapter 9, that abomination of desolation, which was pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem. This abomination of desolation is taking place here between 173 to 165 with the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. By smooth words, verse 32, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about this. Talked about how the Maccabees and certain Jewish individuals like Mattathias stood up against these wicked forces, and a revolt took place. But there would be death among the Israelites, but God would provide for them as well. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Verse 33, "If they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy." Some of the Jews would assist the forces of Antiochus Epiphanes against their own people. And some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. my understanding here, verse 35, the end time, again, I think that points back to Daniel chapter 8. That end time that was being mentioned were these events in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. There's a lot of confusion sometimes trying to point that to the second coming of Christ. So what we have here is this really detailed account of events that are taking place during this time, during these days of Antiochus and these other rulers in this divided kingdom of Greece. Now, the last section of Daniel chapter 11, verses 36 through 45, there's a couple of different views. The author takes the view that this is still speaking about Antiochus Epiphanes and the eventual death of Antiochus Epiphanes, and that's my understanding as well. There are some false teaching out there with respect to, is this talking about some Antichrist? But I think the best way to understand this is to go back to the beginning of chapter 11, understand the context and the time frame with respect to after these kings of Persia and after Alexander the Great in the days of Greece and these other kings that arise during this time. And so where I am right now, my understanding is that this last section is still emphasizing Antiochus Epiphanes. And I know we're not doing due justice with the rest of this part here, but we only have a couple of minutes left. There are some other views. Another view is that this is pointing to the days of Rome. And potentially, maybe that's pointing to the days of Rome. We know Rome is a part of the context of the book of Daniel, but I think it's still connected here with Antiochus Epiphanes and these events. And so when we get to chapter 12, in verse 1, it's a continuation. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, so remember, we talked about him earlier, who stands guard over the sons of your people will arise. And there will be a time of distress, everything you see in chapter 11, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. So you have to connect this to what we just read in chapters 10 and 11. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Now, some may want to point this to the second coming of Christ and this literal resurrection, but this seems to be pointing to some kind of spiritual awakening. And I don't think it's pointing to the second coming of Christ, because we're still in the same context of these events that will take place during this time. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. So we have another reference to the end of time, which seems to be pointing to this time of intense persecution. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river and the other on that bank of the river, what we already talked about back in chapter 10. And one said to the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? So everyone is kind of trying to ask the same question. How long? When are these things going to take place? And in verse number 7, he says, by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. And that seems to fit with what we've seen with the events of Antiochus Epiphanes back in Daniel chapter 8. This time, times, and a half a time. It's an undisclosed period of time, but eventually it will stop. This persecution and this suffering will stop. Now, Daniel has some questions too in the last couple of verses, but he is reminded, listen, seal everything up that you've seen. These are going to be events that are going to take place in future days. So remember when this was happening. This vision took place in the first year of Darius the Mede. So that's going back to 539 BC. So this is pointing to these events in the days of Greece. Now, I do want to end in verse 11 and 12, and I did hear the bell. But I think this language in verse 11 and 12, this idea of 1,290 days, this abomination of desolation, and 1,335 days in verse number 12, I think it's something here to help the people of God, including Daniel and those who would read this, to see that, yes, there would be this persecution that would arise, that would come, that would happen. But if they would be able to persevere and endure, these things would not last forever. there would be a cease or a stopping of these events. So I know we went through that quite quickly. If you have questions, please let me know. I do think it is very critical that we are not confused of, this is pointing to the second coming of Christ. I don't believe that. And I don't believe that because of the context in which it is couched in. And so understanding these historical periods and people and dates that we have will certainly help us with understanding Daniel chapter 11 and Daniel chapter 12. If you have questions, please let me know. Thank you for staying a couple extra minutes.